Howdy, it's Kyle, taking a look at the geographic distribution of fan bases for various sports teams in the 5 major pro sports leagues in the US. A few years ago, I took a look at something similar to this, but here I want to look at individual cities and sometimes entire states that don't have any pro sports teams to see who they root for. Is it just based on geography, the closest team, or are there other things going on? But I also want to take a look at cities that do have maybe 1 or 2 pro sports teams, but to see who they root for in the sports where they don't have any teams. I'm going to start off by talking about the NFL, American football. That's the most popular sport in the country. And most of the maps I'm going to be showing in this video are going to be like this, showing color at the county level with the color representing the most popular sport team in that area. And what these maps show is which team is the most popular at the county level for single game ticket sales, season ticket sales, and season TV package sales. Also, I purposely cropped out the legends on these maps. I think part of the fun is looking at it and trying to figure out which of the teams these colors represent. The first place I want to discuss is going to be Erie, Pennsylvania. It's the northernmost county in the state, right there along Lake Erie. I remember when I was a kid, there was a vignette on ESPN or CBS Sports or something talking about Erie and how it's roughly equidistant between Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Buffalo. In that particular year, the Steelers, Browns, and Bills were all pretty good. And tells you how long ago that was. But talking about how people in Erie were kind of divided between the 3 teams. So I wanted to look at where Erie stands in the NFL in terms of this methodology. And according to that, for Erie in the NFL, it leans towards the Cleveland Browns. I was a little surprised, and this could be a case of where it's maybe 40, 30, 30, where it's all very close and maybe there's slightly more in favor of Cleveland. So now I want to look at the map for Major League Baseball done by the same company using the same methodology, even though the map does look a little bit different. And here, Erie is shown in baseball to lean towards Pittsburgh and not Cleveland. Again, I would have to imagine it's pretty close, but without a Buffalo team having any kind of impact on Erie, maybe you have a little more people rooting for Pittsburgh over Cleveland. I don't know. So I'm going to switch back to the NFL map. Don't worry, I'm going to go back to the baseball map later on, but I want to go on to different parts of the NFL map and see what other places root for when they don't have a team. Looking over at Columbus, Ohio, right in the middle of the state, appears to be favoring Cleveland over Cincinnati in the NFL. For the sport of football, I would imagine Columbus is more interested in college football with an Ohio State University being located there, but it looks like the overall state of Ohio tends to lean towards Cleveland. In that same part of the country, I find it interesting that the northernmost counties in Pennsylvania, the ones that border New York, tend to root for the Buffalo Bills. These are mostly pretty rural counties, and they're probably picking up local TV stations from New York. It's also interesting how the Bills dominate upstate and western New York. And fans of the Buffalo Bills will often use "Go Bills" as a greeting, kind of like "What's up?" like "Go Bills." Yeah, go Bills. You go into New England, of course, you're going to have dominance by the New England Patriots. You do have a handful of counties in there that are actually for Miami Dolphins, and apparently there's one big Detroit Lions superfan in central Maine. But I think part of it has to do with the TV package thing, and I'll get into that later on, as some of these counties will look kind of weird in some situations. Another one that I'm not sure I agree with is southwestern West Virginia. I have a lot of in-laws that live there, and they're all big Pittsburgh Steelers fans. I don't see a whole lot of Cincinnati Bengals stuff there, but according to this study, the Cincinnati Bengals are more popular in Charleston and Huntington than the Steelers. And then coming south to Chattanooga, we're about halfway between the Tennessee Titans and the Atlanta Falcons, and according to this map, and I would say I agree with this, it leans towards Tennessee. Although, kind of like Columbus, Ohio, there's much more interest in college football here, but NFL fans do tend to lean towards Tennessee more than Atlanta. Kind of like New Jersey, it's hard to tell the line in Florida where the Miami Dolphins fans become the Jacksonville Jaguars fans. The colors are pretty similar. But generally speaking, northern Florida, as well as the coastal portions of Georgia, tend to root for Jacksonville. I was a little surprised to see Jacksonville's influence go so far into the Panhandle, but apparently it does. I do find it quite interesting that the Indianapolis Colts tend to have more of a following in terms of aerial footprint in Illinois than the Chicago Bears. And yes, most of the people in Illinois do live in the Chicago metro area, but the parts of the state that aren't near Chicago do tend to root for Indianapolis in the NFL. Going down to Texas, the San Antonio and Austin areas don't have an NFL team, but as you can see with Texas, it definitely leans towards Dallas Cowboys more than the Houston Texans. With the exception of the counties in and right around the Houston area, the whole state tends to be going for the Cowboys. Oklahoma as a state doesn't have an NFL team, but it does tend to lean more towards Dallas Cowboys, but there is a big following for the Kansas City Chiefs there as well. And this map is from 2024, so you can see basically all of Missouri has rallied behind the Chiefs after the Rams moved back to Los Angeles. So according to this study, people in the St. Louis metro area have no problem rooting for the Kansas City teams. You'll see in spots in the interior Northwest like Idaho, Montana, portions of Utah, as well as the Great Plains, you'll see a big rainbow of colors there. And what's happening here is that the populations of these counties are so low that just a handful of fans in that one county could sway the whole thing to lean for one team or another. I mean, there could be some county in rural Nebraska where it's just literally one super fan changing the whole color of the county. And the counties colored black are the ones where there isn't even sufficient data to give it any color at all. The populations in those counties are so small that there might not be anybody in that county that pays for any kind of single game ticket or TV sports package for any team. Heading to the west, and Salt Lake City, Utah is one of the largest metros that doesn't have an NFL team, and you can see they're split here between the Arizona Cardinals and Las Vegas Raiders. That does make sense, but I wonder if the Denver Broncos had more of an influence in Salt Lake before the Raiders moved to Vegas. You go to California, a good chunk of the state roots for the 49ers, and apparently only Los Angeles County roots for the Rams. The rest of SoCal goes for the Chargers. And the NFL landscape in Southern California has changed a lot in the past 10-15 years, so I'm not sure if this is accurate, but it seems like it makes sense. I grew up halfway between San Francisco and Los Angeles, and in the 80s and 90s, I can say that the 49ers were the most popular NFL team, with the Raiders being a close second, and not really that many Rams fans, honestly. But if you look at the national map as a whole, you can see many state lines are well defined. So you can see there are parts of the country where that state line does make a difference. And look at the Midwestern state lines. You can really see some more state pride with their teams there. Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Indiana. Those state outlines are really obvious. Minnesota is entirely purple. Wisconsin is almost entirely green, except for a couple of counties outside of the Twin Cities. The lower peninsula is all blue. The upper peninsula is surprisingly mostly for Green Bay. Indiana, the shape of it is almost perfectly coincided with the Colts. But once you get outside of the Great Lakes states, with the exception of Tennessee, it looks like people tend to just root for the team that plays closest to them. And that makes sense. You turn on the local broadcast, and what are you going to get? What's the local game that's going to be shown? Or you go to the local Buffalo Wild Wings, what's the game that's going to be on the big screen? And say you live 2 or 3 hours away from the nearest team, but you want to go to a game, you're probably going to go to the one that plays the closest to you. All right, so now I'm going to go back to that baseball map and talk about where the Major League Baseball fan bases go. This is an older map. It doesn't look quite as good, but it is the same methodology as before. And right away, you'll notice some huge differences just because not all the same cities have teams in these two leagues. So I'll start right away in the middle of the country, all that yellow, that's the St. Louis Cardinals fan base. So you can go back to the football map, St. Louis here, where there is no NFL team anymore. They tend to root for the Chiefs now, but you go back to baseball where they do have a team, and you can see, well, the St. Louis team has a huge influence on the region. And similar to NFL, in baseball, the Chicago team does not extend its dominance very far down into Illinois. You get to Peoria and Springfield and Southern Illinois, and they tend to be rooting for the Cardinals. For the NFL map, we saw Indianapolis dominate Indiana, so the whole state was rooting for the Colts, but in baseball, there is no team in Indianapolis, and as you can see, the state is divided 3 ways. Indianapolis is located right in the middle of all 3, where the Cubs, Cardinals, and Reds fan bases come together. Unfortunately, they use the exact same color for both the Detroit Tigers and the Cleveland Guardians, so you can't really tell where the split is. But for baseball, Toledo, the northwestern portion of Ohio, does lean towards Detroit. However, in the NFL, Toledo in that area tends to lean towards the Cleveland Browns. So it's kind of like Erie, where in one sport it might root for the team in one city, and for another sport, a team in a different city. Although I would have to imagine in Toledo it's probably pretty close to Detroit, Cleveland in both football and baseball. And then going up to Wisconsin and Michigan, just like in football, the team that plays in Wisconsin seems to have its influence extend well into the UP of Michigan. And then going back over to Lake Erie, there's Buffalo, and people in Buffalo tend to root for the Toronto Blue Jays. And I would say that Buffalo has a closer connection to Canada than Detroit does, even though they're both literally right there on the border. But it does feel that Buffalo is more influenced by Canada than Detroit. But I think part of it is also the people in Buffalo don't want to root for the teams in the New York City metro area, so there is no baseball team in Buffalo, so they're not going to be rooting for the Yankees or the Mets. And then going into New England, the Boston Red Sox, as you would expect, dominate the entire region except for the 2 southwesternmost counties in Connecticut. And it's really hard to tell, but according to this methodology, the Mets are more popular than the Yankees on Long Island. That comes as a bit of a surprise to me, but it goes back to something else I was mentioning before about the TV markets, and I'll mention that later on to kind of when I sum things up. And then you get to the South, you can see almost total dominance by the Atlanta Braves in the non-Florida Southeast. The Braves' popularity extends way west into the South, well into Mississippi, extends here and up to Nashville, big Atlanta Braves territory. But you can see with just how much dominance Atlanta has over a large region that if they are going to expand in Major League Baseball, one of the teams they expand will have to be either Nashville or Charlotte. And then you go over to Texas. Remember, in football, the Houston Texans had very little influence outside of the Houston metro area, but for baseball, the Astros control the southern half of the state as well as most of Louisiana. Both the San Antonio and Austin metro areas lean toward Houston Astros over Texas Rangers. And overall, the Texas Rangers' influence is nowhere near what the Dallas Cowboys' influence is. But with that being said, the Rangers are the most popular team in Oklahoma City, but not Tulsa. Tulsa's right in that battleground where the St. Louis, Kansas City, and Texas fan bases all come together. And then you go up the Missouri River to Omaha, and they don't have any major pro sports teams there, but people in Omaha generally root for the teams that play in Kansas City. Heading to the west, I think a really interesting spot is again Salt Lake City. One of the largest metros without a team, but for whatever reason, the Anaheim Angels are popular there. Sears Tower, Twitter, Anaheim Angels. But with that being said, I do believe Salt Lake City is the #1 city being proposed for potential expansion. You go into the northwest, the Mariners dominate that area, including most of Oregon. You can see the San Francisco Giants' influence is mostly the northern half of California and just the far southern part of Oregon where few people live. The Reno, Lake Tahoe area has usually been pretty big for San Francisco Bay Area sports teams. You can see that Las Vegas is big Dodgers territory, and there has been some rumors about maybe the A's moving to Vegas, but there also has been some hesitancy in that because there isn't much wiggle room. There isn't much space for another team there because you already have the Dodgers, the Diamondbacks there. There's maybe going to be a team in Salt Lake. There just really isn't a lot of space for another fan base. So remember, in football, Columbus, Ohio leaned toward Cleveland, and now in baseball, it leans toward Cincinnati. Columbus is roughly halfway between the two cities. It is a little bit closer to Cincinnati, though. But I think for Columbus and Ohio in general, because college baseball isn't anywhere near as popular as college football, Ohio State's athletics don't have as much impact on the overall fan base of the pro baseball teams. But a lot of times, it's not going to be just geography. Geography is usually going to be a huge part, but also historical success will be important as well. Many of the teams that have more historical greatness have a larger fan base that's been able to extend farther out. And I know people in Central California that are diehard Pittsburgh Steelers fans. They were born and raised in Fresno, but their parents in the 60s and 70s were big Steelers fans because of all the great things they were doing. And they had kids and they were brought up watching Steelers games on TV. And by the time they were old, even though they're in California, they're big Steelers fans. And I think many other teams have that same type of following, the Dallas Cowboys, the 49ers, New York Yankees. But despite that, I do think it ultimately still does come down to geography more than that. So now moving on to the next sport. If you're a sports fan, you probably already know what league this is a map for, but this is showing the fan bases for National Hockey League teams. One thing very important to note is you'll see very little green in northwestern Washington. You think they have more of a following there. Well, this was actually done before the first season of the Kraken, so that green is people that were just getting excited about the team starting. I would imagine if you would do another map right now that much more of the Northwest would be that kind of green and not gold for Vegas. But tying into that, this map was created while the Coyotes were still playing in Phoenix. Now they've moved to Salt Lake City, so we'll probably see quite a bit of change there. I think the Arizona fans will probably still root for Utah. I'm not sure. I can't imagine them switching over to rooting for Vegas or LA. So I think the western portion on this map will change quite a bit in the next couple of years. We'll have to see. You go over to California, the northern half of the state's going to root for the Sharks. Most of the LA metro area is going to go for the Kings, and then the Orange County and San Diego is going to be going for the Ducks. Texas, with just one team, the Dallas Stars, are going to control the entire state, and their influence goes well into Oklahoma as well. And then going up north from there to Kansas City, they don't have a hockey team. They have baseball and football. Well, who do they root for in NHL? Well, St. Louis. So I find that very interesting about the state of Missouri. So if St. Louis and Kansas City, if their city doesn't have a team, they'll tend to root for the one from the other one. And then you think historically, the teams that play in Kansas City and St. Louis have never really been huge rivals against each other. There was never a huge Chiefs-Cardinals or Chiefs-Rams rivalry. There's never been a big Royals-Cardinals rivalry. So I think folks in Missouri feel okay rooting for the team that plays in the other part of the state because there really isn't that same kind of cross-state rivalry in there. But just like in baseball, the St. Louis team's popularity extends more into Illinois than the Chicago team does. And yes, more people do live in northern Chicago, and there probably are more Blackhawks fans in terms of total number, but in terms of aerial distance and just coverage of fan base, well, St. Louis has more of Illinois than Chicago does. The entire UP is bright red. The Red Wings have been one of the more dominant franchises in NHL history, so they have a huge fan base going back many, many years. But then look at Wisconsin. They have a baseball and a football team, but not hockey. Who are they rooting for there? The people of Wisconsin are forced to root for either Minnesota or Chicago, and it appears the people in Milwaukee are going for the Blackhawks. I've always wondered why Milwaukee hasn't been the number one spot for expansion idea for the NHL. It seems like a no-brainer. And yes, I know they love the Admirals there, the minor league team, but come on, man. They'd rather have an NHL team. And if you're a hockey fan in Milwaukee, you don't want to root for a Minnesota or Chicago team. You go down to the south, you'll see a lot of gold for the Nashville Predators, including the entire state of Tennessee being outlined. There's a lot of gold on the map, but do realize that hockey really isn't very popular. So even here in Chattanooga, you don't see a lot of stuff for Nashville Predators. There isn't really a huge following, although people that do like hockey do root for the Predators. The NHL has tried to expand in Atlanta twice, and it's failed both times. There just isn't really much of a hockey following in Atlanta. So there aren't a whole lot of hockey fans in Atlanta, but they do tend to root for Nashville. And for Florida, hockey is the only sport where the team in Tampa dominates the state. That is worth noting that the Columbus Blue Jackets fan base extends into northern Kentucky to Cincinnati suburbs more than the Nashville Predators do. But just like with baseball, for hockey, Toledo tends to lean towards Detroit, and the Youngstown-Warren area tends to lean towards Pittsburgh. And then going up to the northeast, you can see Pittsburgh dominate Pennsylvania, and Erie, in this case, is going for Pittsburgh over Buffalo. And just like in football, most of the state of New York outside of the New York City metropolitan area is rooting for the Buffalo team. It's hard to see the difference in the shades of blue for the Buffalo Sabres and the New York Rangers, but most of New York and all of Western New York is for the Buffalo team. All of Delaware is going with Philadelphia, none of it with Washington. And you go up to the northeasternmost county of New York State and the northwesternmost county of Vermont, and that's going for Montreal Canadiens. And that lighter shade of red to the west of there, the northernmost counties of New York, they're going for the Ottawa Senators. That's a bit of a surprise. I would expect Montreal fans in northern Vermont and New York like that, but not really so much Ottawa. And in case you're wondering about that one random rural red county in South Florida, that's not Red Wings, that's Ottawa. I can't imagine there are many hockey fans there, so maybe just 10 Ottawa Snowbirds can change that color to being red. Okay, so now we're going to go on to the NBA and see where different basketball teams' fans bases go. All right, so you look straight in the middle of the map, you see Oklahoma red all the way through. So this is the only sport where Oklahoma has its own team, and the Thunder does dominate Oklahoma. But not only that, the Thunder's popularity extends into the Texas Panhandle. And then Texas itself has 3 teams, Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio. And it appears to be reasonably evenly distributed fan base-wise between the Mavericks, Rockets, and Spurs. But then going just east of Texas, there's also a team in New Orleans. But then for basketball, there's also a team in Memphis. So there are 3 teams in Texas, 1 in Oklahoma City, 1 in New Orleans, 1 in Memphis. That's 6 teams all right there in the south central U.S. So you get a little bit of a different dynamic in terms of where the sports fans' bases are going, because you have, say, Arkansas now being pulled in multiple directions by all these teams. And just like in football, Indiana has its own team and it's dominant for the entire state. But just like all the other sports, central and southern Illinois might be just as big, if not bigger, for teams playing in Indiana or Missouri. In this case, the Indiana Pacers do have quite a bit of following in central and southern Illinois, but the Chicago Bulls still do have a big following there as well. I would imagine the Bulls having a bigger following into more of downstate Illinois has something to do with Michael Jordan. But look at that huge jumble of colors in the Mink states, Missouri, Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas. Without a team in either St. Louis or Kansas City, fans are all over the place in terms of the NBA. Look at how nice and orderly Oklahoma is, but a lack of team in Missouri creates sports fan chaos in the Midwest. Going over to Ohio, there's only a team in Cleveland, and most of the state, including Columbus, rallies behind them, but not Cincinnati. People in southwestern Ohio tend to root for the Indiana Pacers. Earlier, I was saying how in Missouri, people will often root for the team that plays in the other big city if their own city doesn't have that team, and they're okay with that. In Ohio, you do have more of a Cincinnati versus Cleveland type rivalry, so I can see people in Cincinnati not wanting to root for a team that plays in Cleveland. And the same thing is true for its next door neighbor, Pennsylvania. There's no NBA team in Pittsburgh, but people in Pittsburgh aren't about to root for a Philly team. So you can see in Pittsburgh, they're rooting for the Cleveland Cavaliers as well. And then you go up to Buffalo, just like in baseball where they don't have a sport, they're going to root for the team across the border in Toronto. So you've got a bit of a Raptors following in the Buffalo, Niagara Falls area. And once again, the Boston team dominates New England. You go down to Florida, Tampa Bay does not have a team. They tend to root for the Orlando Magic as opposed to the Miami Heat. With 3 of the 4 corner states having their own team, you can see those state outlines pretty clearly: Utah, Colorado, and Arizona. It appears as though after the Seattle Supersonics moved to Oklahoma that the people in Washington took to the Portland Trailblazers pretty good. And then we get to California, and this is where I see many problems on this map. And the first thing I see is that really the Clippers are more popular than the Lakers in LA, and the Sacramento Kings are more popular than the Golden State Warriors outside of the Bay Area. So I can say with pretty good certainty that's not true, so I do want to go over what is one of the flaws with this particular methodology. So this is looking at where people buy season ticket packages to go to the games in person, but also season ticket packages like the TV packages. You can watch all the games at home. And one thing I've noticed is that on many of the sports where you have 2 teams playing in the same kind of area, the team that's actually the less popular one shows up as the more popular one on these maps. So for example, Los Angeles County is showing red for Clippers as opposed to yellow for Lakers. The same thing was true with the Mets over the Yankees on Long Island. And there were a few counties actually going for the Miami Dolphins over the Patriots in New England. I think what's going on there is that if you live in that local spot, you flip on the local TV, the local broadcast is going to be that main dominant team. It's going to be the Lakers or the Yankees. So if you live in that area, you have to get the TV package to get all of your games. So if you live in Los Angeles and you're a Lakers fan, you don't have to buy the TV package because all the games are going to be on TV anyway. If you're a Clippers fan, you might have to buy that package. So I think this particular methodology doesn't work as well when you have 2 cities or 2 teams right in the exact same spot where they're overlapping. And for those random counties in New England, for the Dolphins, that might be snowbirds that have been going down to South Florida for so long that they've taken a liking to some of the Florida teams. And maybe when they come back to New England, they want to watch a couple of the Dolphins games because they're not going to be the ones on the local TV. Okay, now I'm going to look at the Major League Soccer map. I'm going to have less to say about this because there isn't as much data on this, and this is literally the only thing I have to look at this for soccer. So I'm going to go back to Ohio, a very fascinating spot for sports geography, I think. So this is the only sport where there are 2 teams in Ohio, but neither one of them are in Cleveland. The Columbus team is much older, so they have much more of an established fan base that extends into western Pennsylvania, including Pittsburgh. The Cincinnati team is a recent expansion team, so they haven't established a huge fan base yet. And you can see where I live here, Chattanooga is colored red for Atlanta United, who is definitely more popular than Nashville here. And that's because Atlanta is older than Nashville. So Atlanta was the first. They got to establish a good fan base. A lot of folks in Chattanooga that are into soccer got into Atlanta United. Later on, Nashville came on, but a lot of folks were already fans of Atlanta and didn't really take to Nashville. For a while, the Chicago Fire was the only team in any close proximity, so you can see just how much expanse. And then you go up to Michigan, it's the only one of the major sports where Detroit doesn't have a team. You look in the West, you can see a little more uniformity with colors here as opposed to the other sports. Major League Soccer started off with a huge presence in the West with teams in Los Angeles, San Jose, Seattle, Portland, Salt Lake, and Colorado. But notice how there isn't one in Arizona, and you get a pretty big mix of colors going on there. But yeah, a lot more black on this map because there's a lot more counties of insufficient data. This is simply because soccer just isn't as popular in the U.S. as the other sports. So that was my look at the geographic distribution of sports fan bases in the 5 major pro sports leagues in the U.S. And like I was saying at the beginning, there's no definitive way to really map this stuff. It's just more of a fun thing to look at. It would be kind of cool to see an actual real scientific study that takes into account all these different things like social media following and plus merchandise sales and TV package sales kind of stuff. That's put it all together. I think you get a really good look at this, but it's still kind of fun to look at, but just don't take anything too seriously. It was just kind of fun to discuss. If you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up to let me know you approve, and subscribe to this channel if you're interested in learning more about geography from a nerd. And with me, you got to get one of these Mirrorway maps. They're beautiful. Coming up to the holiday season, it's definitely a wonderful gift for people that are into maps and stuff. So yeah, there's a link in the description for a nice coupon code. You can get 12% off your order. But yeah, thanks for watching. Geography King signing out. I'd like to give a special thanks to my superior patrons for their support. If you're interested in supporting the channel, you can check out my Patreon page. The link is in the description. As always, thank you very much.